Have you ever sat there listening to someone speak a foreign language and suddenly realized you're understanding absolutely nothing? I mean, zero. Just a total wall of sound. We've all been there, right? And let's be honest, it is incredibly frustrating. You try so hard to focus, you're grasping for just one familiar syllable, but eventually your brain just totally shuts down. And after a few minutes of that absolute confusion, you naturally just kind of tune out. It's a completely universal experience for language learners, and man, is it exhausting.
But there's actually a completely different way to look at that frustrating moment. What if that feeling of shutting down isn't actually your fault? What if the problem isn't your natural ability to learn a language, but rather the type of input you're using? I really want you to know right now that those struggles, they're usually a systemic issue with how we've been taught to learn, not some personal failure on your part.
Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we are going to unpack a concept that honestly completely transforms how human beings acquire new languages. We're looking at a deeply powerful framework known as comprehensible input. By the time we finish this explainer, you're going to see your entire language learning journey in a completely different and way more forgiving light. Let's start with section 1, the myth of word decoding. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it perfectly captures a massive misconception. See, a lot of learners think language learning means you have to painstakingly decode every single word. So what do? They constantly pause the audio. They try to meticulously translate every single sentence. They obsess over memorizing these huge lists of isolated vocabulary. It is stressful and, quite frankly, it's pretty tedious. But true understanding is completely different, because real comprehension just doesn't work word by word. Your brain actually understands a message by building meaning from the context around the words, from picking up on patterns, feeling the speaker's tone of voice, and from repetition. It's kind of like a giant puzzle. This is exactly why you can sometimes totally get the gist of a message, even if you don't actually know every single word being spoken.
Moving right along to section 2, what exactly is comprehensible input?
So the term comprehensible input was popularized by a linguist named Stephen Krashen. And the idea here is incredibly simple, but literally a game changer. It states that you acquire language best when you mostly understand what you're hearing or reading, even if some parts of it are still totally unfamiliar. Just think about what a huge relief that is. Instead of suffering through dry, isolated grammar drills, your brain is actually designed to gradually and happily absorb linguistic patterns simply through meaningful exposure. As long as you're getting the overall meaning, your brain is doing all that heavy lifting in the background. Which brings us to section 3, context and cognitive load. Now, let's talk about the science of why this works, specifically cognitive load theory. In cognitive psychology, this theory explains that our brains have a very limited working memory. We can really only juggle so much new information at one time. If the input you're receiving is just way too difficult, like, say, jumping into a live news broadcast in a language you literally just started learning, your brain quickly becomes totally overloaded. And when it overloads, it just stops processing effectively. It completely shuts down. This directly explains that frustrating wall of sound feeling we talked about right at the start of this explainer. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how we fix that. Context is absolutely the ultimate tool for solving this working memory problem. When you use friendly context clues, like visuals on a screen, the physical gestures the speaker is making, sticking to topics you're already pretty familiar with, and leaning into repeated linguistic patterns, you are essentially giving your brain a massive shortcut. These clues help your brain predict meaning without having to process every single syllable. It makes understanding so much easier, and it makes the whole learning process way more efficient. So what does this actually look like out in the real world? Well, we can break down some highly accessible, practical examples of comprehensible input. It could be a children's cartoon, right, where their dialogue is naturally simple and highly visual. It could be a podcast for learners that's tailored with slower, clearer audio. It might be a video explainer that relies heavily on visual demonstrations to show you what's going on. Or it could be a graded reader, which is basically a book specifically designed to match your exact current reading level. The absolute key across all of these formats is this. You just need to understand enough of what's happening to follow the message without having to hit pause and constantly translate. And actually, I really need to highlight that last point, because relying too heavily on translation is for sure one of the most common pitfalls for learners. While translating might feel safe, an overdependence on it can actually severely slow down your direct comprehension. It entirely disrupts the natural flow of how your brain actually wants to learn. So the crucial point is understanding the fundamental difference in how our brains process this information. Research in second language processing tells us that fluent learners gradually learn to process meaning directly in their target language. That's fluent processing. They hear a word and boom, they instantly know the concept. On the flip side, translation processing means constantly, exhaustively, converting everything you hear back into your native language first before you can even understand it. Comprehensible input is absolutely vital because it trains your brain to skip that middle step entirely. It forces your brain to connect meaning directly with the new language.
All right, section 4, the effective filter hypothesis.
So Stephen Krashen proposed another massively important idea alongside comprehensible input, and it's called the effective filter hypothesis. Basically, he argued that negative emotions, specifically things like stress, anxiety, and fear, can literally block language acquisition. Think about being called on in a strict classroom when you have absolutely no idea what the answer is. When learners feel overwhelmed, embarrassed, or pressured, the brain essentially puts up a defensive wall. Your effective filter goes up, and your brain becomes drastically less receptive to absorbing any new input at all, no matter how comprehensible it might actually be.
But there is a wonderfully positive flip side to this. When the material you're consuming is actually fun, engaging, and understandable, you relax. And when you relax, that affective filter drops right down. Your brain opens up and learning improves entirely naturally. This is exactly why finding enjoyable content isn't just some nice bonus in language learning. It is absolutely crucial and entirely necessary for your brain to do its job.
Let's move to section 5, finding your ideal input. Let's see how this all builds into what we call the Goldilocks zone of input, because honestly, a lot of learners completely misunderstand this part. If you only consume input that is completely easy, well, there's no challenge and your brain doesn't acquire anything new. But if you jump straight into complex, native-level content way too early, you're not going to understand a thing, your effective filters skyrockets, and you just become easily discouraged. The ideal input is right there in the middle. It should be slightly challenging so you're exposed to new things, but still understandable enough that you can stay totally relaxed and fully engaged with the story.
And finally, section 6, how to apply it.
Okay, here is your practical roadmap for applying comprehensible input effectively today. First, choose content deeply connected to your personal interests. If you absolutely love cooking, watch cooking videos in your target language. Second, use subtitles strategically to help lower that cognitive load, but please, don't rely on them permanently. Third, and this is a big one, always focus on understanding the overall message, not every single individual word. Let the unknown words just slide by if you can grasp the main point. And finally, number 4, expose yourself to the language consistently over time. Remember, language acquisition is gradual. Your brain absolutely needs repeated, consistent exposure over a long period before these new patterns become automatic. When you put all of this together, it creates a massive paradigm shift in how you approach your studies. Comprehensible input requires you to change the ultimate goal of learning. You have to stop trying to forcefully memorize the language through endless drills and flashcards. Instead, you simply begin trying to understand the actual messages being communicated to you.
And honestly, that is the most empowering takeaway of all. When you lower your stress, find content you actually enjoy, and focus on the message rather than the individual words, your brain does exactly what it evolved to do. Over time, and with consistent exposure, that relaxed understanding naturally transforms into genuine fluency.
So we know that getting the right input is the secret to fluency. But even with the absolute perfect material, one specific challenge always seems to trip learners up more than anything else. You might be able to read it, you might be able to guess the context from a visual cue, but how do you actually master the single hardest skill of all, pure listening comprehension? Well, that is exactly what we are going to explore in our next explainer. See you then.